My arrogant sister-in-law insists on including her tormentor son in my child's birthday celebration, only to descend into mayhem when I refuse to endanger my son. My imperious sister-in-law commanded that I extend an invitation to her bullying offspring for my boy's birthday, then lost control when I declined to jeopardize my son's safety. I am a 37-year-old woman, married for 9 years to my 40-year-old husband, Harry, and we have a spirited 7-year-old son, Nate. Harry's sister, Kim, also has a son, Dean, who is nearly Nate's age, and there was a time when my son and Dean were inseparable, sharing playdates nearly every other day, until things began to shift. For the past couple of months, Nate has been earnestly confiding that Dean, once a friend, is now relentlessly bullying him at school, both boys attending the same institution and previously sharing the same classroom, but after my son tearfully recounted being taunted, mocked, and ridiculed by Dean, I immediately approached the principal and arranged for his class to be changed. Both Nate and Dean are in 2nd grade, and I exhausted every possible remedy to mend the situation before resorting to that decisive action. I confronted Kim about the bullying, yet she merely chuckled and dismissed it as typical boyish antics, insisting that they would simply outgrow their squabbles. My son, a rambunctious little whirlwind himself, made it clear that if he truly lamented the constant bullying by Dean, there must be an underlying issue far beyond mere roughhousing. After I suspected that the root of it might well have been Dean, given his consistently unruly behavior at the party as well, nevertheless, Kim maintained an air of nonchalance, acting as though nothing whatsoever was wrong with his conduct. Neither Nate nor I were eager to attend that gathering, given Dean's disruptive antics, but my husband was insistent, so we ended up going despite our misgivings. I had hoped to avoid any conflict by merely making a brief appearance, thinking that a simple showing would suffice, and so we did, returning home without incident, with everyone ostensibly pleased. A few weeks later, once Nate's class had been changed, Kim and I found ourselves no longer meeting or engaging in any direct, one-on-one dialogue. A few days ago, I meticulously sent out invitations to a multitude of mothers from Nate's playgroup. As his birthday was just a couple of days away, I deliberately omitted Kim and her son because Nate had expressed a firm wish that Dean not attend, and I shared that sentiment completely. But when Kim discovered that I had deliberately omitted her even though a multitude of other children had been invited, she became incensed, calling me at length to demand an explanation and ensure her son was included. I bluntly conveyed the genuine reason behind her son's exclusion, sparing no details, because I believed she had been allowing him to run amok and behave in an utterly unacceptable manner. I could understand, to some extent, that she had just endured a devastating breakup. However, that circumstance was hardly an acceptable excuse to allow her son to behave so recklessly and without discipline. Even if she insisted that such behavior was permissible within the confines of her own chaotic household, I was resolute in refusing to have my son, nor myself, ensnared by that toxic influence. She raged furiously, unleashing a torrent of vicious accusations against both me and my son, before abruptly hanging up the phone. I didn't think too much of it, as I had long expected such a volatile outburst, and her tirade ultimately made little difference to me, given that our connection had never been particularly intimate or meaningful in the first place. After she stubbornly refused to discipline her son properly, I mentally severed all ties with her, though out of deference to my husband I once earnestly attempted to maintain a cordial relationship by attending her son's birthday celebration. However, as 3 months passed and her son's unruly behavior only worsened, I saw absolutely no justification for forcing either of our sons to be friends when it was painfully obvious they simply did not get along at all. My husband was clearly displeased upon discovering this, yet he chose to remain silent about it. With Nate's birthday looming in just 4 days, and following that tumultuous phone call during which Kim refrained from further discussion about the invitation, 2 days ago I found myself compelled to attend an out-of-town wedding that necessitated an overnight stay. After the wedding, my husband told me he couldn't join because he was tied up with work, and Nate, not wanting to miss school for even a single day, also opted out, leaving me to attend alone. The arduous journey was a grueling 4-hour drive, and by 11, both the wedding festivities and the lively after-party had completely wound down. Upon arriving at the hotel, I phoned my husband to check on both him and Nate, only to be astonished when he revealed that Nate was not present. I couldn't fathom his words, for it was terribly late and I had expected my son to be safely at home. When I inquired about his whereabouts, he nonchalantly stated that Nate was with Kim, a revelation that stunned me, as I had explicitly forbidden any contact with her or her son, not out of personal animosity, but simply because Nate had made it clear he did not wish to be around them. Once I recovered from the shock, I sharply snapped at my husband, demanding that he immediately bring Nate back home, but he coldly replied that I was overreacting, asserting that they were just kids who could easily sort things out with a simple sleepover. I ended the call with my husband, his words sounding utterly mad, and promptly reached out to my parents, instructing them to go to Kim's house and retrieve Nate, keeping him safe at their home until I returned the following day. I also contacted the authorities, who, along with CPS, accompanied my parents to ensure that Nate was safely brought back home. I'm not entirely sure what transpired that night, but later my parents informed me that Nate was deeply upset, having wept uncontrollably throughout the night, and had even stubbornly refused to have dinner at Kim's house due to some cruel things Dean had said about me, which he had undoubtedly overheard from his mother, so she sent him off to sleep without any meal. Nevertheless, he was immensely relieved to escape that toxic atmosphere and ultimately return home with my really vulnerable child, who isn't even 10 years old. I couldn't find any peace until I confirmed his safety with my parents, and even then, I trembled like a leaf in a storm, overwhelmed by the gravity of the ordeal. I immediately set off on the drive home once I knew my son was secure with my parents, and I informed the police that I intended to press charges against both Kim and my husband, since I had to appear in person for the legal proceedings. I promptly left the hotel at around 11:30, hastened to my parents' home to see my son and verify his safety, and then made my way to the police station where I formally pressed charges against both my husband and his sister. They were detained for 1 day but were subsequently released, with the stipulation that they must remain within the state until the charges were either dropped or they were acquitted. I suspect they were let off rather lightly, considering the gravity of their actions. After all, Kim had essentially removed my child from his home without my consent, an act that was completely unacceptable. Perhaps he wasn't physically injured, but he was utterly distraught and so overwhelmed that he refused to go to school that day, convinced that any encounter with either Kim or Dean would inevitably result in more relentless bullying. While a certain degree of roughhousing had been common between them, this was entirely different and had to stop. If a 7-year-old is so frightened of another child as to be terrified merely at the sight of him, then undoubtedly something is very amiss. I prevented my son from attending school that day, and I have now resolved to file for divorce and seek full custody of Nate, for I no longer believe my husband is capable of prioritizing our child's mental and emotional well-being over familial loyalty. He never even apologized, but as soon as he recovered his phone, he texted that everything I had done was utterly repulsive and that he no longer wished to see me because, in his view, I was completely unfit to be a mother, insisting I would only raise a delicate girl rather than a son, and he was totally opposed to the idea, leaving me with the painful choice of either returning to him on his oppressive terms or battling him in court for custody. I didn't respond to his message, but a few hours later, another text arrived from him stating that Kim was in the hospital because of me. Apparently, he claimed that due to my overreaction the other day, Kim's ex had filed for full custody of Dean and had even attempted to take him away, arguing that she was incapable of raising him, and since she couldn't even control him, given that CPS had become involved and she was already facing charges for her handling of Nate, things were now looking very grim for her, resulting in Dean being removed from her custody. I find myself utterly confused, wondering what to believe, especially regarding my decision to report my husband and his sister to CPS after he permitted her to take our son to her home to bond with her own son, the very boy who bullies and frightens my child. Update 1. I want to thank everyone for the overwhelming support. It was heartening to have people on my side, given that aside from my parents, almost no one else is currently backing me. Everyone is in deep distress over Kim's self-inflicted injuries, which tragically resulted in her admission to a rehabilitation center after a severe mental breakdown. I cannot understand why his family, and even some of our supposed friends, are placing all the blame on me, when in truth, the violent outburst she just exhibited only further proves that she is entirely unfit to raise a child at this moment in time. This could have easily occurred while her son was inside the house with her, thereby putting him in danger as well, so perhaps I did everyone a favor. Yet, most people have accused me of overreacting and being excessively sensitive. How could I be, when the woman literally removed my child from our home and my husband allowed it, even going so far as to act as if everything were perfectly fine, despite knowing full well that Nate despises being around his cousin, and I only called the cops because my husband flatly refused to care for his son, leaving someone absolutely to safeguard our really vulnerable child, who isn't even 10 years old. Update 2. Today, my husband responded to the divorce petition, and he isn't contesting it, a relief, since I doubted I could have endured the stress otherwise. However, he remains unwilling to relinquish custody of Nate, which now presents a significant problem. My lawyer and I had anticipated this, preparing for such an outcome, and I believe everything will work out favorably for us, especially given my husband's past actions that would hardly convince any judge to let Nate stay in his custody. Notably, he hasn't visited Nate or me since I left, and I've been residing with my parents for some time. He hasn't even bothered to check on Nate's well-being, which is ironic considering he claims to want custody of his son. It's almost comical how, despite his desire for custody, he can't be bothered to inquire about his own child's condition, and frankly, that works to my advantage. Nate has been asking about his father, and while breaking that news to him will be incredibly difficult, I know it must eventually be done. I wasn't strong enough to confront it before, but now that I'm proceeding with the divorce, the reality has become unmistakably clear, and I must let the poor boy know that his father will likely no longer be present as he once was. I trust my son will thrive with me, yet it pains me deeply because he is still so young and fragile, and it shatters my heart to know that nothing can quite replace the presence of a father figure. I am hopeful that the love from his grandparents, along with mine, will help fill that void, though I know nothing can completely mend it. I am truly upset that I must subject my son to this loss, yet my parents have been a tremendous support, caring for Nate, which has been a blessing since they are both retired and have ample time to help around the house. This support allows me to concentrate on the mediation process and my work without the constant worry of whether Nate's emotional needs are being met. I do spend about an hour each night playing with him and talking before tucking him into bed, but an incessant guilt lingers, as if that isn't enough for him. I worry ceaselessly about whether I'm being a good mother, and I fervently hope I am, for without that, I truly fear I would lose myself. Update 3. It is now the night before our first custody mediation session, around 3 a.m., and though it's a warm summer night, I'm shivering uncontrollably because of what my deranged, immoral soon-to-be ex-husband has done. It began when Nate and I were just about to retire for the night around 9:30, and suddenly the doorbell rang. Moments later, my father burst into our room, urging me to come downstairs because my husband was at the door. Confused and reluctant to speak to him, I told my dad to shoo him away, but he remarked that my husband seemed utterly out of sorts, suspecting he was either heavily intoxicated or on drugs. My father even asked if I wanted to call the police before I could respond. Then I heard my husband screaming my name and hurling incomprehensible insults at me. Both Nate and I were terrified, and I insisted that my dad call the police immediately. Barely had we dialed when we heard the shattering of glass from downstairs, followed by my husband's raucous laughter and the sound of a car pulling away, signaling that he had left. My mother, who had been asleep, awoke at the sound of breaking glass and hurried upstairs to check on me. Thankfully, we all remained unharmed, though deeply traumatized, frozen in fear until we were sure he was no longer lingering nearby. Even after the car drove off, we couldn't believe what had happened and were too scared to breathe too loudly. When we went downstairs to inspect the damage, we found that the madman had hurled one of my mother's decorative potted plants through the glass window in our living room, scattering shards all over the floor. Without delay, we called the police and pressed charges against him for property destruction and harassment. It turned out he had been drinking and even celebrating his successful attempt to rid me of him, along with his family, from the home we had cherished for so long, a twisted idea hatched by his family to torment me on the eve of the mediation. At the police station, his mother practically pleaded with me to let the incident slide, dismissing it as a mere prank, but I held firm, ignoring her desperate appeals. Now, hours later, I still cannot fully process the shock. It is surreal that the man who was once the love of my life could do something so cruel and deranged. Although Nate had fallen asleep, he was clearly shaken, repeatedly asking if that was truly his father's voice he had heard. I couldn't bring myself to answer, thinking it best to shield him from further distress. I remain in shock, but I have already informed my lawyer of everything, certain that my husband will not appear for tomorrow's mediation. I plan to file a restraining order against him first thing in the morning. Update 4, I have wonderful news to share. My husband and I are now officially divorced. Although it took some time, the court expedited our proceedings given the emergency of the situation. I have been awarded full custody of my son, and I am relieved to know I will no longer have to endure any contact with him or his family, a development for which I am profoundly grateful. As far as I know, Kim remains in rehabilitation for her mental issues, and my husband is likely to face serious legal consequences for his actions. I am now attending therapy with my son to heal from the emotional damage inflicted by his family, and we are planning a special mother-son trip soon to lift his spirits. I couldn't be happier about how things have turned out. It was an incredibly rough period, but now I am stepping into a new chapter of my life, filled with hope and excitement for the future.